Okay.
Okie dokie, we are live. This is Literary Roadhouse, one short story once a week. I'm Maya.
I'm Anais.
I'm Remy.
And I'm Gerald. And before we get started, I just want to let you know that if during this discussion we get a little excited and carried away, our language may wander into PG territory. But we do endeavour to keep things G-rated if we can, and especially with this particular story, because I know it's very popular in English classes. So if you're of a delicate disposition or you have children listening, please check the show notes on the website and in the description on your podcast host.
Okie dokie. And with that in mind, this has been a huge week for Literary Roadhouse. If you're not following on Twitter or you don't go to the website, you may not be aware, but this week we launched 2 additional podcasts, and they're both getting really good reviews so far. The first one that we launched was the Literary Roadhouse Book Club. Right now we are reading Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. And we also launched the Bradbury Challenge, where 3 writers attempt to write 1 short story every week for a year. So if you want to find out more about all of our podcasts, please visit literaryroadhouse.com. Also, we are in the iTunes store. If you just do a search for Literary Roadhouse, all 3 podcasts will show up. And please leave an iTunes review. That's really important, especially for the new shows. So let me just get right into the summary. We read The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. The story was published in 1891. It's really, really commonly taught in schools, and it's an important piece of both feminist and mental health literature. So in this story, we have a young married woman her and her husband have gone into the country to go spend the summer in a big house in order to help her recover from what is considered a temporary nervous depression. Her husband is a doctor, her brother is a doctor, and being a female in Victorian times, she doesn't really have a lot of agency as far as how she can be treated. She repeatedly asked to please go downstairs at the beginning because there's something that makes her uncomfortable about the yellow wallpaper in the big room where she is. She's given the resting therapy, and so she's not allowed to do anything that might excite her, and she's pretty much trapped in that upstairs room. Gradually throughout the story, the yellow wallpaper starts to take on more and more significance to her. She begins to see things in the yellow wallpaper. She sees a woman behind the yellow wallpaper, and she tries to get the woman out. And in the end of the story, she is crawling around, creeping around against the yellow wallpaper, locked in as her husband is trying to get in. And when he finally gets in, he takes one look at her and faints, and she continues to crawl around the room over his body. So let's just jump right into this story. Top level, how did everybody like the story?
I'll go first, 'cause I normally do go first. I started off by not liking it at all. I didn't like the format of it. I didn't like much about it, and the whole sort of situation irritated me. But then I changed my mind, and I liked
Ooh.
it a lot.
I'm going to be curious to see when it was that you changed your mind.
Mm.
How about you, Annie's?
I loved it. I loved it from beginning to end. I mean, the beginning is a little on the slow side, but I still liked even when, yeah, just a kind of commentary on like being a wife in that time and everything, even in the beginning. And then by the end, I'm just like, ah, so good. I loved it.
And Remy, did you hate it?
Um,
You have that look
I
on your face.
what is the that I
It's
hate? No,
the I hated it look. I'm undecided look.
yeah, more like my transformation was from curiosity to confusion. So I'm actually waiting to hear this discussion because I have some unanswered questions here
hmm
that I'd like cleared up.
Okie dokie. That all sounds interesting. Um, Hopefully we'll be able to dive really deep into the story. It's got a lot of symbolism, so there's a lot that we can chew on. I read it both on my Kindle, and I also listened to a LibriVox recording that was on YouTube. it made an amazing audio listen, I gotta say. The girl that did it had this amazing accent, and it was just an amazing audio listen. Let's just talk first about what we liked about the story. For me, I like the pacing. I like how it started off really slow and then it slowly ramped up. I like the symbolism in the yellow wallpaper and how she becomes more and more identified with it. And on paper, the beginning of it was a little confusing just because it's older, sounding. Plus, it's got a really English tilt to it, so it was a bit rough. And then as I heard her voice more, it was a very enjoyable read. And the audio recording definitely helped me be able to hear her accent and how she spoke, and it lended something to it.
Mhm. As I read it, I think one of the things I enjoyed the most was trying to figure out what kind of story this is. So sometimes, I think at the beginning I went into it expecting it to be a very kind of feminist story, because in that time, feminist literature was coming up, right? This is contemporary to Kate Chopin. But then I'm like, is this a ghost story? I'm still not sure it's not. Actually, I mean, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't
That's
matter.
actually debated.
It's debated. Is it a ghost story? And then there was like, is it a cautionary tale on like the effects of mold? Because she starts smelling funny things.
There's
Because,
black mold behind the wallpaper.
well, because she smells a funny earthy odor, and then she describes her husband and sister-in-law's behavior as odd too. I'm like, is everyone going mental because of the mold? In the end, they're not. But it's just as I read the story, I kept thinking I was reading something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me the slowness of the start I didn't like. I thought I thought the author spent too long talking about the wallpaper, and later on I could see she was building up the story and building up the tension. But to me, the sort of first two-thirds were a little a little a little slow, and also I don't like stories that feature women that are being persecuted. It's and I think we've been through this before, and it
You
makes me
want to live
feel
in a nice fluffy world with Remy,
no.
where
Yes,
everyone's nice and moral and says good day and doesn't
life
take
is
too
good
long
here.
to get through the doctor's line.
Yeah, I think I'll join him. But he gets up
Join
far too early.
us.
Yeah, he gets up far too early for me. But yeah, I don't know what it is, but yeah, I think it's too easy sometimes to show women being persecuted and bullied as this woman was, um, and being forced to do things that she doesn't want to do. So, but once I got over that, and once we got into the final third of it, where her condition started to deteriorate, and the room started to become more of an active player in the story, then I got into it a lot more.
Yeah, one thing that I noticed when you said that, you talked about it being slow and you talked about the difficulty you have with stories where women are in that persecuted situation. And in this case, what I find really interesting is the author wrote this story as a response to her being treated this way. She had been hospitalized and
Really?
given the resting treatment. That was common back then. Mental illness was considered to be a problem of the female reproductive organs, and that if women weren't docile enough or whatever, you could send them away and have them docilized.
Is that a word?
That's weird now, but the idea was anything that might excite a female would make it worse. So they weren't allowed to go walking outside. They weren't allowed to like read anything, write anything, do anything creative, talk to anybody. They just had to lay there. And it would make women worse. It would make
Mm.
sane women insane. So, this is one of those things where not only do you have an old treatment in like an old concept, but you have an old style of writing too. And I can definitely see the changes in writing conventions in this story. I can see things that are like bridging between like an old fashioned style and a modern style
Mm.
because parts of the story feel really modern. parts of the story sound really modern, and then parts of the story still sound really old-fashioned, and I thought that was really interesting.
And that's one thing that confused me because I didn't realize when I read it that it was as old as it is. So I was reading it as a piece of contemporary fiction.
It
So
totally sounds so much younger,
it's
doesn't it?
yeah, which sort of explained a bit of my annoyance at the treatment of her. But then when I realised that it's an old piece of writing, it sort of makes a bit more sense. But yeah, I think you're right, Maya. It definitely shows very modern techniques in the writing, and it really works like that for me.
I
It's
was
funny.
trying to. Oh, sorry, Anais.
No, go ahead.
I was trying to at first place the story temporally and figure out what era it's in, but there were a few clues I noticed, like the John the physician asking the narrator to take cod liver oil and lots of tonics as treatment. So obviously that gave me a sense that it was set in the
Victorian.
past.
Mm.
Yeah. But I was also curious where you thought it was because Maya, you said it had an English tilt to it, and that's what I thought too. But Anais said that it was set in New England, in
Hmm.
America.
Yes. Well, the reason I say that is because I need to find the story exactly where it was. I should have jotted it down. There's a clue that it is an American setting, and also it was published in New England. And it's an American writer, so with
Hmm.
all of that together is why I think it's in the United States. But in a time where, like, having an English
When
style
Americans
house is a
still
big
talk
deal.
like that.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Um,
there was that affected, like, upper class
mhm.
accent that was an American mimicry of an English accent still.
And which New England has, I mean, New England is like baby England. It really is. Like all the
Mm.
names are the same and the rivers and the towns. So it's easy to confuse the two if you're not specifically told. But I do think it's New England.
Interesting. So,
Um,
mhm.
I was gonna say though that because we were talking about how it feels old, but so I went into it knowing it was an older story, and I remember thinking, I wish modern stories did more of this. So one of the things that I liked about it was it just so I feel like modern stories in general have a tendency to over explain in short punchy sentences but still like tell you and this is when she's losing her mind. Like they'll like
Mm.
say it where this one she says in an earlier diary entry, women don't go creeping about, during the day. And then later it's like, when I creep about during the day, I lock the doors. And then later it's like, I creep up and down the lanes all the time, just like
Mm.
casually without explaining if there's been any kind of slip here.
Yeah.
That's funny. I suddenly had a TLC song going through the back of my I couldn't help myself. Yeah, I agree with you. I've been in writers groups where people are like, explain this. I'm like, why? Can't you like think about it and have some mystery left in your story? And I think that's because I still read a lot of old fiction and
Mhm.
people expect to have everything explained. One of the things that this story does is it has a lot of symbolism. And I don't think a lot of modern stories, like, if they're having symbolism, the symbolism is really obvious, or it's like symbolizing maybe two things most. And the symbolism in the story is very multi-layered, and which is different from what I'm reading in a lot of modern stories, and something that I would like to see come back. Um, we can talk a little bit about the actual wallpaper because the wallpaper figures very prominently in the story, including the title. And I'm just curious for you, what symbolism did you guys pull out of the yellow wallpaper?
Yeah. Just before we talk about that, I think you're right. I think the this older stories seem to have more time to tell the story, and the pace seems a lot slower generally, and there seems to be more room to develop the ideas and the themes and the symbolism, and I think short story writers in modern times seem to be in too much of a rush. There's sort of, I don't know, it's almost as if they're anxious about the word count, and they want to keep it punchy and short.
Well, they're actually told in school, in MFA programs, and by editors that if you don't get the writer in the first like one paragraph or 5 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever, then people aren't going to read your story, and you have to start in the middle of the action, and you have to make, like, they're taught that.
Yeah.
And they're taught that a lot of these older techniques are wrong, like showing, don't telling. Well, if you look at a lot of early 19th century, late whatever 20, there was a lot of telling, and there's more telling still in literary fiction than there is in genre fiction, but we're constantly, new writers are told, don't do that, it's bad. Whereas it's not bad in all cases. So I wouldn't necessarily blame the writers, but I would blame whoever, the people who are teaching writers what's okay.
Yeah. So going back to the symbolism in the wallpaper, so it's funny too because there was a lot of different symbols in the wallpaper, and then it changed with my changing of the story. So the first one with the woman behind the bars, I'm like, oh, here's the feminist theme. Then now there's mushrooms. I'm like, mold again. The mold's back.
Maybe marriage is like mold. Sorry, Anais.
Grows on you like a fungus.
That's funny. And did you feel like the you know, by the end of the story, had your view of the wallpaper changed significantly, or was it staying pretty constant by then?
I'd say so. The wallpaper gets more and more detail as she starts sort of giving it meaning to entertain herself, right? So the wallpaper just starts off splotchy with weird yellow discoloration, and by the end of it, it's got like a whole saga to it, and a front layer and a back layer and this and that. But I think what was most interesting for me was the change in the wallpaper physically. Like it's ripped here, it's not ripped there, it has a line on the bottom. In the beginning, it starts already torn, but I feel like even in the beginning, she was already a little insane, and she did the ripping herself. Like, you know how before she starts crawling on the floor, she's like, there's like a line just above the mop board. Where did that come from? Then later she starts crawling. I'm like, it was probably from you, and you didn't even realize it because she had already been losing it at that point. So that was more interesting for me, like the physical aspects of the wallpaper. When she's like, how did that happen? She's a little unreliable narrating there. Because it was her, I think.
Oh, yeah.
I think you're right. I think the fact that more detail comes out in the wallpaper is a sign that she, her grip on reality is drifting, and yeah, the fact that she suddenly sees this line on the wallpaper, and where did that come from? And well, it's sort of fairly obvious where it came from.
And Remy?
Yes.
Did you not see any symbolism in the paper by then? Were you just confused, or?
Yeah, I was confused. I just thought it was
Wallpaper?
No, it symbolized her insanity.
Yeah. For me, it definitely does. Like it is like a visible, tangible, like externalized example of her losing her mind. I think that is very clear on a top level. But I think that it symbolizes a lot of other things too. The fact that the paper has somebody trapped behind it. The fact that it makes her uncomfortable when they first get there. Like originally she does not want to be in that room, and by the end she does not want to leave that room. I think that the wallpaper in some ways represent her status in society. So as a woman then, she didn't have a lot of freedom. She is completely defined by the men that she's surrounded by. And I think that the wallpaper represents that feeling of being trapped in something that should be pretty. So, the bars, that's obvious. She's trapped in there. It's a nursery. She can't get out. That's a really obvious one. But a lot of times we don't see our own imprisonment because that imprisonment looks attractive. And I feel like the wallpaper had that tinge of it's really attractive, but it's still really oppressive. And I think that I think you guys are right. Like the ripping of the wallpaper, I'm pretty sure it was probably already just a little bit ripped, but the rest of it all came from her. The smishing on the wall was really obvious that something was up by then. But what I really liked was, you know, the back of the wallpaper versus the front of the wallpaper. Her body getting better, but her mind getting worse. And when she says to her husband, her husband's like, "You're getting better. Look at you. You're getting more weight on. You're looking better." And she's like, "But I'm not better. My mind is sick." And he gets mad at her for saying that because sickness is physical. And I feel like the wallpaper, the behind the wallpaper and the front of the wallpaper, for me represented some of that division between being physically ill and mentally ill.
And the other thing was this nursery that she's in also had bars on the windows. So then now she's seeing the woman behind bars when she is literally also behind bars. And the bars is also what made me think, like, could this be a little ghost story-ish? Because he's like, oh, bars in the windows was a nursery. I'm like, yeah, or where they kept a crazy person who died here and has now possessed you. Like, if you go the horror route.
Because they did. They put bars on windows of nurseries, but they put bars on windows of asylums. There's like a whole, like, bunch of professors that do read this as if it was a ghost story, because it is written in the Gothic style.
And we know for a fact it wasn't intended as a ghost story because the author was very explicit about what it was about. She wasn't even subtle because the doctor she was protesting who gave her the bad treatment is the Weir Mitchell guy that John's like, oh, in the fall we'll send you up to Weir Mitchell. She used her doctor's name. Like, she's not subtle.
And then she sent him a copy.
She sends him a copy. She sends him a copy like, so this is what you told me to do, and this is how it felt.
I like her.
Yeah.
Oh, that's her real doctor.
Yeah.
He's a real guy.
She has an axe to grind, and she's not hiding it.
Hospitals all over the place instituting his resting cure. It was really common, and the story was pretty instrumental in explaining that it isn't necessarily a good thing. It can make you crazy.
Yeah.
What do you guys think she was suffering from?
Insanity.
Be more specific.
Please.
I think she had postpartum depression.
Yeah, I think so. She mentions a child, and later on she mentioned children. So I don't know.
And when she said that she preferred it up there because she couldn't handle him.
The baby, yeah.
I can't remember the exact line, but I was like, postpartum depression.
Yeah, I thought of postpartum, and that's what I thought it was throughout the story. And then when I read the author's interpretation, like what she says it's about, she doesn't mention that. But then again, it wasn't something people named back in the day.
There wasn't. It was just hysteria and female organ problems.
Yeah, so I wonder if she was picking up on something that didn't yet have a name, but was still, describing, like, this seems to be a time when women are especially susceptible to having these sort of nervous breakdowns.
I think you're probably right. I know that when I was doing research on old asylums, like ages ago, for a novel I was writing, I ran into an amazing photograph of a woman in an asylum, and in the description, it was like her 6th hospitalization after the birth of a child. So every time she had a kid, she would lose it, and then they'd put her in the hospital, and then she would go back home once she was better until she got pregnant again. And I think that there was a lot of that. And I think that might be actually why doctors originally thought maybe it was a female issue, because it is kind of dramatic what hormones can do to women. And so they took that and extrapolated that all mental illness must be female issue. When, you know what I mean? Because sometimes we'll see like one thing, the symptom of one thing, and we'll just try to use it to make sense of everything. And I think maybe that's why. I would like to think men just weren't that big of beep.
Well,
I was just wondering, did men not have depression and mental illness back then?
No, they were just stressed out.
Talk about it.
Theirs was legit, though. When a guy's sad, it's because it's so tough to be a guy,
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it wasn't legitimate. I'm just saying the double standard sucks. Yeah.
Boys don't cry.
Yeah, double standard really sucks. And in a lot of ways, we still deal with I think maybe that's why it feels so modern. In addition to the fact the second half of the story for me had a lot of action, had a lot of suspense that was really modern feeling. Like, did anybody else get like that feeling, like, if you're reading like Talented Mr. Ripley or something and your chest gets a little tight and you're like, what's going to happen? I kind of got a little bit of that. So yeah,
I definitely, the pace picked up, second half, last third, that sort of time, when the story really started to come to me. Then I think it was, I started to get into it more.
And there was a few other things that also in the second half that made it seem more mysterious, like when she's like that there's a yellow staining and that it's staining everything. Like, where's that coming from? Like, there's just all this other stuff. And also her sister-in-law's name kept changing, which I thought was funny. It was Mary, then Jenny, ended in Jane. I'm like, why? It's the same person. I think it plays into that kind of.
I didn't catch Mary. I know that at the end she says me and Jane or something, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not it was a typo, whether she's referring to Jenny and she's getting the name wrong because she's nuts, or whether she has named her externalized version of herself that's crawling around behind the wallpaper.
No, because the first time she mentions the like sort of nanny, it's Mary, unless they have like multiple, but she only ever refers to one. I thought it was
one person.
Yeah, I thought it was multiple people. I thought she had one person that was taking care of the kids, like elsewhere, and then Jenny was her husband's sister that was cleaning. But I think it can be read multiple ways. Yeah. For me, that's one of the things that I took away from the story, is that ambiguity can be done right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to be afraid of reading ambiguous stories.
Yeah, because normally when we read an ambiguous story and we don't like it on this podcast, it's because it's either one ending which does not work and sucks, or one that's great and we want it to be the great one. While this one, all the different spokes that it could be are equally awesome.
Yeah, I think that for me is like the biggest thing that I liked about this story. Because any way I read it, I liked. It wasn't like we've had stories where it's like we've disagreed on what we've actually read, and we're like, if we read it one way, we like it, and if we read it another way, it sucks. And this wasn't that. This was, I can read it anyway, and it still felt equally interesting and nuanced.
Yeah, it's interesting about the name, and it seems as though maybe Jenny is the person behind the wallpaper, perhaps. It is ambiguous, and but she also says, so now she is gone, and the servants are gone, and the things are gone, and there's nothing left but that great bedstead nailed down. So there were other people in the house.
Did anyone else pick up on towards the end of the story how the wallpaper, when she is identifying so closely with the wallpaper and she's crawling around, both her and her husband start staring at the wallpaper and complaining about the yellow staining. Like, it's getting everywhere.
And Jenny too. That's why I thought there was mold.
That was really symbolic to me. It's like, not only was she identifying with this yellow wallpaper, but it's staining everything in the house. And that to me was like, wow, what a great metaphor for mental illness.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah,
it affects everything and everyone, doesn't it? When one person suffers.
Yeah.
So why do you guys why do you guys think that this story has lasted so long? I mean, it's taught in universities, AP classes. Like, this is one of those like core like American canon stories. I'm just curious.
I think maybe, like we said, because it has different interpretations. So there's a lot that could be said about it.
And also it's accessible. It's not written in an old-fashioned style, so even to modern students, it's very readable, and the language is pretty good. So I think it's a good example of an old story.
Yeah, and I think the fact that the author was so vocal as well about what it's about, and also she said that the reason for her, what she needed was writing to get better. And the same thing as the protagonist and narrator in this story. And the author also said that one of the reasons why she thinks that men at the time restricted writing is because it was a way for women to form an identity, and it was a source of freedom. So she was so outspoken about that aspect of it that you can just tie it into all the other feminist stuff happening in that era.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that I think you're right. I think that this story tends to stay in your conscious. It's one of those stories that when you read it, it gets under your skin, and then later on when you go to teach somebody something, you're gonna pull this out just because it's still there. Like it's a very sticky story. I think in part because it's touching on universal, like the description of mental illness in here is like a description that someone that's ill could write today. Like even though the names of the illness, isn't modernized, they don't have the symptomology understanding of it. It's a very modern, very truthful description of what it would feel like to be in that situation. I think that's part of it, but also I think that again, it's an old-fashioned story with a lot of layers, but it's written in a modern way, so it's really accessible.
Yeah, and like you just said, the mental illness still carries over to today, the way that it's described. And also some of the feminist stuff too, because her husband is so patronizing. And I've been patronized that way by men. Okay, not to this extent, or at least I wouldn't marry a guy who did, because I have a choice now. Yay, 2016. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, or that
Yeah.
that seemed alien to me or preposterous. Not at
It's one
all.
thing when one man patronizes you, it's another thing when the entire society backs him up.
Yeah, yeah. But to some extent, there's still a certain amount of there's still, I think, a difference between mental illness viewed in men versus women. I
Yeah,
think it is a little harsher and more patronizing when it's in women, seen
exactly.
as hysterical.
One thing that came up for me was the color yellow. I was thinking, would the story have had as much impact if it was like the blue wallpaper or the red wallpaper? I think it would have if it was like red, but yellow is one of those colors that can either be really sunny and beautiful or like really gross, like a puce color. It's a color that they tell you can, like, it's one of those colors that makes you anxious and like like have like a lot of energy. And I thought that was a really interesting and wonderful choice for that description.
Yeah, there's a lot of shades of yellow that make you think of filth.
Yeah. It can go from beautiful sunny sunflower to ew, disgusting real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even in the beginning she describes it that way as being, gross and disgusting and just a color that's just not making her happy. But by the end she's like, I like this, I like to creep around in this yellow because if you creep around outside everything's green out there. And that was one of those lines that was like, whoa, she's gone. She's not coming back.
And yeah, and also the way he talks to her, and the way he patronizes her, and even she admits, John laughs at me right at the start. She said, John laughs at me, but of course one expects that in a marriage, and it's just, she just said, well, that's just how things are, and it's, I don't know, I find that very awkward and very demeaning for women to have a character that will just accept that, husband laughs at me. It's
But by the end she doesn't. I think that's one of the things that's so beautiful. In the beginning she's like, yeah, he laughs at me and he loves me and he takes care of me, and by the end she's like, I want him to go away, I want to be with myself. Like she changes as she finds freedom in the wallpaper. Like for her, being ill and giving herself over to the wallpaper is almost more freeing than her everyday existence, which is kind of creepy and scary to think about. But
that's
I can see a situation where you're like, life really sucks. Can I go have a vacation in a mental hospital because it might be better?
Right, and that's the feminist interpretation, right? That she's escaping sort of like the chains of her marriage, where being insane and crawling around and being this way is better than being, the wife and adhering to those roles. And then if we said earlier how there was that whole bit about like she probably tore out the paper. Remember when she's guessing it was children in a nursery who tore it off, and she
Mhm.
said to stick it like closer than a brother, the wallpaper to the wall. She said they must have had perseverance as well as hatred. So then with that line, the feminist interpretation is even stronger because it's just like if we don't believe that children ripped this out, that she ripped it out, then it's her hatred and her perseverance to get out of it that dedicates her to this insanity scheme. Not even scheme.
Mhm.
She's been driven crazy by it, but it's a form of freedom.
So do you think if she hadn't have been trapped in the room with the yellow wallpaper, like if he would have said, "Okay, we'll go downstairs, you can have the window that opens out onto the roses," do you think she still would have lost it? Do you
I
think it
think
was the paper that made her lose it?
no. I think she needed an outlet. If he would have said yes, you can write your books, I think she would have been fine. But as
She,
long as she
you
can't
don't think
write,
she would have turned into like the Unabomber?
that's the other option. She went the peaceful way.
Well,
Reams of paper, like something out of Seven.
wow.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about what we liked about the story. I want to hear what you guys didn't like about the story. What bothered you guys? I mean, we know that Gerald was bothered by, the fact that she wasn't treated very nice.
I-
Was I patronizing?
yes, you were very patronising there, patronising as we'd say. But anyway,
But I didn't do it because you were a man. So.
no, that's all right then. So that's allowed, is it? Um, so, yeah, I just I didn't like the pacing at the start, and I've said that before, and I just think there's a lot of words that are not saying very much, to
Mhm.
be honest. I think the first sort of quarter was okay and introducing characters and you get a good feel for it. And I think the second quarter then just for me dragged on a little bit, and I didn't enjoy that as much. And it's only when the pace started picking up towards the end that I began to enjoy it a little bit more. Um, I, Not
How
much
did
else.
you guys do with the pacing? Remy?
Mm, I thought it was fine. I think, okay, first of all, I really appreciate that you and Anais added this context that it's actually reflecting how she was actually treated, because I think that totally changes the story for me. Um, and I think it's a good way, especially in that sort of conservative society and stuff, to give like a big FU to the man.
Were you aware of how women were treated in mental hospitals before the story? Like as far as
Yeah,
mental health?
no, and it wasn't. But I think this was after this story was written, where it was a journalist who embedded herself and went undercover into an insane asylum.
Mhm.
Uh, and her
I know who you're
report
talking about.
fundamentally altered like how mentally ill patients are treated, because even though she was sane, they wouldn't let her out and didn't believe her, and she documented all of this abuse and stuff. But this is why I have another interpretation of this story too, in addition to the ones you mentioned, as I was doubting that she was actually in a house. I thought that she was in an insane asylum, and that she had these delusions that she was married, or or maybe she does have a baby or not, I don't know, or that John is her husband, because there's certain things that made me question that too, like how she says, "Oh, I don't like our room," right? And I wanted like the one bigger one downstairs, but John says, there wasn't room for two separate beds. So I'm like, wait a minute, if they're married, why are they sleeping in two separate beds to begin with? And later on in the story, he says, he calls her little girl. He's like, why are you walking? He's like, what is it, little girl? Like, don't go walking about like this. Why is he calling her little girl if she's his wife? And so I thought he was just the doctor and she was fantasizing or something that they were married.
Yeah, I can see how you can read it that way. That said, it was really common for married couples to have twin beds. You see that still in a lot of older couples. But yeah, I can definitely see how you can read it that way. It's there's like an American Horror Story tint to it, you know? What was it, season 4 or season 5, where they were in the mental hospital? It definitely had like a little bit of that, like how much of this is real. And she was so unreliable that you begin to question everything she's saying. So it's like, if she's unreliable in this way, is any of this really happening? Is she in a hospital? Is she in a house? Is there her husband? I can totally see you reading it that way because she is so unreliable.
Hmm. I like that interpretation anyway, though. But the
Yeah,
same, it's
it's a
the same
fun
separate beds.
interpretation. I kind of want to go
Yeah,
back and reread it that
yeah.
way.
It's more fun that way. Yeah. Um, I think for me, the only times where I was like, okay, get on with it, was once I think maybe I just have a thing for too many nature scenes. When she's looking out the window, she's describing this garden and that garden and this pathway with this hedge and that archway. Okay. I was done with garden
You're
descriptions.
anti-nature. You just don't like nature, do you?
Or maybe it's again the New England nature. Like okay, got it. Like I think if it was like the desert with this cactus would have been different.
Okay, so Anais' rules. No one in New England can describe nature.
No, you're done. You've had a good go.
It's been done.
Centuries of
It's a
it.
theme.
Yeah.
It's been done to death. But this was in 1892, so she gets a pass.
I love you. I didn't have anything I didn't like about the story. I don't.
Wow.
Like, I don't think have I ever had a story that I couldn't come up with something?
Mm.
I
No.
don't think I have. I'm always like super critical.
No, so
I,
I had things, but like I said, you telling me that this was in response to her being treated this way, like things that I would normally dock other stories for, like ramblings or not making sense, I excuse it because the narrator here is insane, so it's supposed to be this way.
But even okay, if this hadn't have happened in real life and it was and let's say the author hadn't ever been hospitalized, but she was writing a fictional story about this woman who is, why would whether or not the author experienced it change whether or not you like the character experiencing it?
Because then it's like a statement piece. In addition to it just
Hmm.
being fiction, it's like sending a message.
But
Again,
even if the author didn't personally
take that
experience
in
it, you
your
can still be a
face.
statement. You can still make a
Mm.
statement about something that you haven't personally experienced. I find this really interesting.
Yeah, but it's a more creative way to do it. I mean, obviously, yeah, she could have maybe like went and talked to a newspaper or something, but I think it's just an added layer that makes me appreciate the story more.
Yeah. Up until this point, I think women probably had complained, but between the journalist that went in and was sane, because obviously, society's not going to take the word of insane people, so you got to get a sane person to tell people how it is. And then having it fictionalized in a way that people could really find accessible, I think probably is like huge reasons why we're not still treated that way.
mm,
Yeah,
yeah.
for me, I think there's because the author is as Rami says, she's making the statement, but also the narrator, she's writing in the first person. So as her condition were, so the grip on the story seems to wander, or the grip on reality as told to us seems to change. But something I sometimes have a little problem is that it's still a story. It still needs to be told for people to read, and I don't like stories that are impenetrable. So
Hmm.
no matter how well they're written, no matter how strong the theme, it still and I think we've touched on this before. It still has to be a story. It still has to be able to be read. Not that I had a problem with this one. It was fine, but sometimes it can make it more difficult to read. But I think she handled that well.
Does knowing the political leanings and history of the author change how you feel about the story, Gerald?
No, no. It doesn't bother me. It's a story, and the author's situation shouldn't affect how I view the story. That's my opinion anyway.
How about you, Anais?
No, if anything, I think I was a little disappointed is not the right word. Um, so when I walked away from the story after reading it, I was like, I don't know what it is. It could be 1,000 things. And then once I was like, oh, it's definitely this. I still liked it, and I like that it's definitely this from her perspective. But I was like, I kind of like not knowing. Now I know, so it kind of like robbed that aspect of it.
Yeah,
But
it
it
kind of
is
took
still,
away some of the mystery.
yeah, it took away some of the mystery. Like, oh, okay, she really hated Weir Mitchell because he sucks. But you know, but it was fine. It still is good to know that that really happened and that was her experience and what her opinion was on that. So it's not that I was disappointed or detracted from the story. It just sort of, delineated it clearly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm like you. I love the story. Before I did research, I'd heard of the story, but I hadn't read the story and I hadn't heard any of the history of the author. I just had heard the story mentioned because the novel I'm working on, part of it takes place in a mental hospital,
Mm-hmm.
and part of it takes place in a modern mental hospital, part of it takes place in like a pre-Victorian mental hospital, 1860, 1850ish. Um, no, 1850s. And so several people had said, you need to read this. And I went into it not really knowing what to expect and fell in love with it. And then after I read the story, I went and did research on the author. And I'm like you, where I love the story. I find the author interesting. It did take away something knowing more about the author, which that's never actually happened to me before. You know me. I'm very much a Nabokovian reader. When I learn more about the author, usually I'll enjoy the story more. But in this case, I did find that the more I knew about the author, it wasn't so much that it made the story less fun, but it kind of tainted it for me a little bit. I was like, oh, so this was her getting back at her doctor, which felt less interesting than just amazing short story written by random woman, which is totally my own like bias, and so I ignore it.
Yeah.
But
Though
I
maybe if you
recognize that this was one of those cases where knowing more wasn't great for me.
Yeah, but this is also one of those stories that even without having it confirmed that she had some, where you're like, there's something that you experienced that prompted you to write this.
Hmm.
Like, I can't see somebody who hasn't experienced something like this just being like, that would be a great story. I feel like you have to suffer through it a little bit,
Yeah, I
you
don't
know?
think that they would have gotten the small details.
Right. Yeah.
There are certain details when you're that close to just losing it that
Hmm.
I don't think an entirely sane person would have picked up on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the details of how the wallpaper changes and the way that she sees the wallpaper is an insight into how has experienced something
And
like
it
that
happens
before.
so slowly that
Mm.
it doesn't shock her. And that's something like I've worked in a boys' home that was for mentally ill children, and they are completely sane in the way that they look, in the way that they're responding to the way that they see their own world. So, and that's something that I think most sane people, when they look at someone who's mentally ill, that's like talking to themselves or whatever, they don't think that in that person's mind, how they're acting makes total sense.
Mhm.
And that's something that, I liked about this story. At no point does she think the wallpaper's moving. Something's really messed up here. Like she says, I'm not getting better, but there's like glimpses of like there's almost
Hmm.
like little pockets of sanity still left over.
Hmm.
But when she's seeing the wallpaper moving, when she's seeing the women creeping, it totally makes sense to her,
Hmm.
which I loved. Is there anything else we want to touch on before we rate the story?
Why did the husband faint?
I think. Well, Annie's. Why do you think he fainted? Before I put in my words, because I've been all noisy this podcast because I love the story.
I mean, I think it was just the shock of seeing her crawling around the room torn to pieces, she's fallen apart. He didn't expect that. Like I think I she's not describing how she looks, but if you like I mean, she gnawed on the bed frame. Like have you ever bitten a piece of furniture? Like she's really lost it. So I think it's that look. It's a way of letting the author know she looks like
Mm.
horrid right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it shocked him. Well, first, I think that he was in denial about just how sick she was.
That too.
And so, like, literally right up until the day before, he's telling her, you're fine, you're getting better, we're going to go home, everything's going to be fine. And then he opens up the door and she's crawling around, gnawing on stuff and totally out of it and has locked herself in the room. And there's a rope, she could have killed herself. Like, I think it was just a shock of seeing a person in that state, but especially a person that he thought was fine. So, yeah, I think it was just really shock.
So I just looked something up real quick. You said that this story was written in 1891?
Well, it was published in 1891, yeah.
Oh, okay. Because the Nellie Bly, she's the journalist that went undercover in the insane asylum, and her expose, I believe, was 1887. So just a few years before this one.
Mm-hmm. It took a while for the treatment of women in mental hospitals to change, because at that point, women could be committed for anything. You could be committed for wanting more sex. You could be committed for, wanting a job, wanting to get divorced. Your husband's just tired of you.
Did we call those the good old days?
I'm tired of this wife. I think I'm just going to have her committed.
And improving on beheadings.
Mental health care didn't get that much better because then we went from the resting cure to lobotomies for a while there.
Yeah.
So, it took us a while to come up with something that was somewhat humane.
Yeah.
Now, the history of mental illness is, we went through a dark period for a while there.
Yeah.
So, if we're going to rate this story, I think my rating is pretty obvious. I think that this is probably the most perfect story I've read on the podcast so far. Like, I literally can't think of anything wrong with it. I love this story. I've reread it, and I loved all of the readings of it. I'm going to reread it some more, so it gets my 6.
Whoa.
Me too. I'm giving it a 6.
Wow.
Woo-hoo!
So
Whoa.
good. Yep. English Gardens in New England.
I'm
Description
surprised.
outstanding.
I was telling people this, Anais, that I noticed throughout the podcast that you and I hardly agree on anything, but this is an exception. So I'm
Whoa.
6.
Wow.
No.
I did not see that coming. Did you see
Not
that
me.
coming? I did not see that coming.
Not at all.
Boom. Mind
Well.
blown.
4.5.
What is wrong with you?
You only gave it the 0.5 just now. You're going to give it a 4. I see it in your eyes.
Absolutely right.
Gerald.
No. I changed it during the podcast. I saw and I thought, well, maybe it's a bit harsh. 4.5.
Oh man, I thought that we might squeak by with like across the board. Okay, Simon Cowell.
I know. I'm not cranky enough.
Okay, so today's quiz is about psychology, of course. So buckle your seatbelts.
Okay.
We're going to go across. I'm going to ask each of you 3 questions.
First, we have to say the stories, though, right?
Yeah.
Huh? Yep, you have to. And if you guys get like all of them right or all of them wrong, we'll have a tiebreaker question. Okay? So, what are you guys throwing into the hat today?
So I'm submitting Monstrous by Leslie A. Tenorio. It's in the Atlantic. He's Filipino. I'm excited.
Woohoo!
I'm putting a story called Drinking in the Loons by Stephen McKinnon from Carve magazine, which is totally unconnected.
We love Carve. We just
Yeah.
He loves car.
we get a lot. I love Carve. We get a lot of our stories from Carve. They need to be a sponsor.
I went back as far as I could. I wanted to sort of, have a. So I think this is from 2007. So it's just there was one a little bit earlier which would have blown our rating. So the subject was a little bit touchy. So
Look at you being all like nice and
yeah, all coy.
okay. Remy?
Good People by David Foster Wallace.
Oh,
Whoa.
yes.
Okay.
Oh, man. Okay,
Mm.
so I'm going to start with Remy
Okay,
because he's on this side of me.
sure.
I'm going to ask you a question, and you have to tell
Ask
me
away.
the answer.
All right.
There's no multiple choice. I'm sorry.
I like those rules.
Okay. In this type of illness, the physical ailment, such as peptic ulcers, are real, but the cause is believed to be mental.
No, actually, I don't like this format. I know like what this is. I just don't know the like clinical name for it.
I know you
It's
know this word because it's so common.
imaginary. No, I don't. No, I don't know. Imaginary sickness.
Okay. Does anyone else know the answer?
Yeah, should we just go across? Like, who's next?
Should we go across or should we be able to steal? Because it might be faster if we steal.
Yeah, let's just steal. Let's
Still, but go across.
but go
Okay.
across so it's fair.
Am I next?
I'm going to give you a chance to answer that question.
Oh, okay. Psychosomatic.
Good job.
Whoa.
Nice.
Did you know that as well, Anais?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were just like,
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
okay, Gerald.
Yep.
This Freudian term refers to all the instinctual desires and energies from the id, not just the sexual ones.
Is it ego?
Anais?
So it's everything that the id wants.
This Freudian
Impulses?
term refers to all of the instinctual desires and energies from the id, not just the sexual ones.
You mean like the phrase Freudian slip? That's all I can think of.
You don't know it?
No.
Okay, Rami?
There should have been multiple choice. Okay, what? So repeat the question.
This Freudian term refers to all of the instinctual desires and energies from the id, not just the sexual ones.
Sexual, all of the.
There's like a huge hint in the question.
Subconscious?
It's libido,
You said
I didn't
not
know-
just the sexual one.
not just the
Oh,
sexual ones.
I didn't know libido was a Freudian word. Or even, yeah. Yeah, weird.
So,
Mhm.
Rami,
yes.
you ready? Let me see if I can find an
Yes.
easier one. Let
Okay.
me find a nicer one. Okay, this one might be better because the next one's kind of mean.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to try not to be mean to you guys. These false beliefs might be of grandeur or of persecution.
False beliefs of grandeur. Narcissism? I don't know.
Gerald?
Nope. Sorry.
This
Any?
is the nice one? Okay.
It was the nice one. These false beliefs might be of grandeur or of persecution.
Delusions? Like delusions of grandeur?
Yay! What is delusions?
Oh.
Oh, well done.
Okay, Gerald.
Yep.
People 18 to 25 are vulnerable to mental illnesses like this, a term used in place of manic depression to describe those who mood cycle between extremes.
Oh,
It's right on the tip of your tongue. I can see the pain.
um,
It's right there. It's right there.
No.
Oh, that was
No.
painful to watch. That was really painful to
Yeah.
watch.
Mm.
Anais, you got this, or do you want me to repeat the question?
Bipolar?
Way to
Mm,
go.
Tip for your
Yes.
tongue.
yeah.
Okay, we're going to do 2 more questions. So, Anais,
Mm.
actually, no, because each of you have gotten 2.
Just give Remy a chance. Come back.
I don't
we'll
want
give-
to. You
we'll-
can have it. It's painful.
As many as 1 American in 50 may be dissatisfied with their bodies. It's called this, a form of OCD. Want me to repeat it?
No.
As many as 1 in 50 may be dissatisfied with their bodies. What's it called? It's a form
I
of
don't know.
OCD.
All I can think is like self-consciousness.
Gerald?
Is it dysmorphic?
Okay. I'm gonna
With
give
an A at the
you
end.
that grade.
Dysmorphia. He got it. He got it. He's
Dysmorphia.
there.
He's got it. It's
Oh.
just so close.
Mm.
Okay, thank you.
What
I
is
can't.
it?
Dysmorphia.
Body dysmorphia.
There you go. That was
Oh,
painful.
okay.
I'm sorry, Gerald.
No, that's fine.
No, give it to Gerald. He got it.
No.
Yeah.
He didn't get the body because there's different types of dysmorphia. It's not just
Oh.
body dysmorphia.
Body
Otherwise, I
dysmorphia,
would
yeah.
have.
No.
No, you have to.
Mm.
No, I'm protesting. This one goes to Gerald.
I'm not protesting.
That was painful. I'm sorry. Okay, next. This school,
Is it me? Or-
Yeah.
Okay.
because that was Gerald,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
right? Right.
Mhm.
From the Latin for about a day, these body rhythms govern cycles of wakefulness and sleep.
The circadian rhythm.
Woohoo!
Boom.
Way to go, Anais.
Ooh.
So, we've gone through 6 questions, and the winner is Anais.
Yay.
Woo!
Yay! Good job, Anais. You just nailed that. You were on it.
Okay. So this means that next week we are reading Monstrous by Leslie A. Tenorio. But before you go, describe for us your wallpaper patterns at literaryroadhouse.com. Story comments are also welcome. And you can also check out our other shows, the Literary Roadhouse Book Club and the Bradbury Challenge. And please, please, please leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spreaker, especially for our new shows. It helps us a lot. And as always, share this podcast with your friends. Until next time, read a good story.
That was great, guys. That was
Woo!
absolutely great.